Welcome to today's video where we're actually going to be going through the return of nitr0 to CSGO. And this is an interesting thing because obviously yesterday we had Team Liquid's first games back since they had the additions of OC, Shocks, and obviously the return of nitr0, right? So what are the main things to think about when you see this new roster on paper? So first off, nitr0's had a fair amount of time away from the game. I think it's now actually, what, a year and a half, right? And ultimately, since then, there's been probably some face at games here and there. Obviously, the prac of the last, however many weeks they've managed to get in, right? And then you've got OC, a primary AWPer, now coming to the team and will be donning the AWP as expected. And then obviously we've got Shocks, incredible veteran, can do a hell of a lot of different things, right? So you consider that nitr0 was, in the last iteration that we knew of, he was basically the primary AWPer, but obviously there was no real primary AWPer in that team. It was a case of Naf picked it up sometimes, Stewie was doing it a lot as well, and then nitr0 would be, doing the same thing really. So we consider that Liquid have not had a primary AWPer on the team since, I think it was JDM. That's 2018. So it's been 4 years. So that's a long time, right? And then before that we had Simple, obviously we had Kusta. We've had a few different iterations, right? With nitr0's time on the team especially, you could even go back to Adren, right? It's a long list of players at that stage. But it's now a case of what do the roles now mean? Because in the interview that Alige had with Banks actually after one of the games, he said that we've actually got a few different role changes. And it's like, okay, well, what are the role changes? Like, from watching it, however, I could very clearly see, nitr0 now has to adapt to a bit more of a different game than what he was used to the last time he played. So, we consider that OC 100% on the AWP, like I said. Shocks is a lurker, right? That's you can't ignore that. That's where he was most proficient, especially the last 2 years or so. And then obviously you've now got nitr0 coming back to the team. So you've lost Stewie, and you get nitr0 as a comparative switch, let's say. And on the face of it, that's actually fine. Like, I would personally think that Stewie's being replaced by Shocks, really. And then obviously nitr0 would be replacing Fallen in that instance. But it's not quite straightforward like that, is it? It's a bit more different. But from watching the games, there's a tweet that I'm actually going to show on screen here, where there was two, obviously 1v3s, which kind of made the difference to them in that game, which, fine. But this was after the second game, so this was after they beat EG. And nitr0 had been involved in 20 opening duels, and he was 5 and 15 in that, which is atrocious, right? That's bad. You can't argue otherwise. But the main thing though is that this was, this is 28.6% opening duel rate. So your opening duel rate, in case anybody doesn't know, that is essentially how often the player is just involved in the opening duel, win or lose, right? So you're a part of the opening duel 28.6% of the time if you're nitr0 in those two games, right? It's pretty straightforward, and if you really had to push an average of it, the same way RWS, technically the average would be 10, because it's 10 players in the server and it's 100 divided by 10. This would be the same thing, if it's 100%, you've got 10 players, and they have an opening kill and death on each player, that means 20% because of that, right? So he's well above what you would consider the average to be. And if you then, there was another tweet I did as well, which kind of looked at the career stats from him. And it kind of showed that, whilst he would be tagged as an entry fragger in the past, but that's, we're talking a long time ago, like a really long time ago, he still didn't really have the numbers to point your finger at him and say he is an entry fragger. It was more of he could be considered a very passive entry fragger, or like the sort of like an AWPer sort of level as well, or like when you consider that he was basically primary AWPing for a lot of the time as well. His numbers are really, I would say, distinctly average for like an opening point of view. Like, there's really not much to tell off. It straight up seems to be about 50-50, not winning much more than he's losing. Like, it's 42 difference in kills, and that's across 7,000 kills. It's really not much. And I'm just trying to think, like, okay, well, is he now being used as like a Nafany or like a Carrigan or like a Boomage? Because those are some of the IGLs now where they feel like they can be very impactful in the game through doing that. So before obviously I bore people to death, I'm going to start loading into the games as well. So we're just going to, this is from the first game against FaZe, but it's just kind of talking about the theory of this. So it's like, if he is playing like this really aggressive IGL, trying to be impactful, there's also an idea of, okay, but why would he do this? And it's like, okay, well, he would do this because, one, he can be trusted to be like, okay, well, I'm going to go in, you trade me, I trust you to do it. Whereas he might not trust himself to do it, especially if he's rusty, right? That's you can't get away from thinking that he's still a bit rusty because of how technically he performed yesterday, right? The KD wasn't great. But if we factor in the thought process of, you trade me, I'm going to go in first, I'll get the information, and that's like the whole sequence, especially on the C side, right? It's now worth considering how well do they actually trade him, because the collective average for like a team in CSGO, at least like the top level, right, if you went on FCU, typically I find it floats around 18% for a team, right? So every kill is an 18% trade rate, which doesn't sound great, does it? It really doesn't seem too great at all. So I figured I'll look at the T-side ones, T-side clips specifically, to have a look and see how often does he really get traded on the T-side. Like, I did have a look at the numbers beforehand as well, and the trade rate was, you know, it's well above that 18% figure. It's more like 40-something%. But, you know, there is a difference, right? Because the opening kill tends to be easier to trade than a kill at 3v2 or a 2v2. Yeah, depending on what situation, scenario, context, whatever. So in the first two clips that I showed, he did get traded basically within 3 seconds. I think that's the cut-off they can get. This one would be an example of where you probably wouldn't consider this to be a trade, because Carrigan dies a good, 6 or 8 seconds afterwards. Like, he didn't even die in the end of that clip just then either. So it's just like, is this the case where we're having to see him adjust completely to now being like an Aphony type, or a Boomage, an Art, or are things going to change again? Because whilst it would be interesting to see the team develop in this way, obviously OC coming in is fantastic. Like, you can't deny that taking him off the AWP would be a great idea. He's a good rifler as well, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he's not good at that, but he's far too good of an AWP to take him away from that. And then you've got Shocks as well, he's not going to be entry fragging for you either. The interesting thing is, towards the last few months of Liquid last year, we saw Elige taking that entry frag role. And I think what's happening is, we're seeing, nitr0 and Elige together as a sort of 1-2 punch. And obviously they've got the chemistry, they've played with each other for a long time. This should definitely be a very doable thing, but we just need to give it time, right? So like, the performances in that group, like yesterday, like, it wasn't... I don't think anybody will say that the CS was great. Like, I think you can say it's enjoyable. Like, there's a difference between good CS and entertaining CS, right? Sometimes it can be both, sometimes it isn't. And especially probably didn't help that they played Inferno so many times as well, back to back to back. So if we really think about things, it's like, give them time, for one. Don't rail on nitr0 either, because like, you can still... You've been away from the game for a long time, and he's played another FPS as well, to be very specific, so a game that is pretty damn similar. You're not going to just suddenly pick up the game and be at the same level as you were before. Like, that would be lying to yourself. And that was a clip of showing sometimes it literally isn't tradable on that first evening kill either. And that was actually down to FaZe putting in some fantastic utility. And then this clip, funny enough, was a few rounds later. This was round 29 as well, so this is showing he can still be very, very impactful while doing this role, and this is why we should still believe in the potential ideas behind this. And this is very similar to the previous one, like I said. But the key is, this is one where fortune is in his favour, you might say, because he's in the exact same spot, nobody behind him really to trade, they're getting ready to execute. Flash comes in, and he actually gets the double kill, and in a way he's kind of close to getting the third, even though he isn't really. But even on that kill that he gets, well, Carrigan gets in return, the trade still happens 5 seconds later. And that is, great, that's fantastic. It's still working out really, really well. So, I think the conclusion from all this really is just see how things go, but I don't know, it's hard to, from the outside, obviously, this is me assuming things as well, this is me basing it off of how the gameplay has been. It was something like 33 opening duels yesterday, and I think he won, what was it, 10 of them, and then lost 23. Like, that's an awful number. I think he had I think his opening duel on the T side specifically, he was dying first a quarter of the rounds that they played on T side, and it's like that's that's crazy, to be honest. That is actually nuts. Like that's like genuinely insane. But I'm here for it. I'm very willing to see how it goes. I personally won't put much stock in it. I don't think it's gonna be a great idea, but I don't think there's much else they can try and do just yet. So if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be trying to do more of these sort of things, looking at the new teams, new rosters, or anything like that.